Reformed. I'm Pastor Brandon. Joined with Pastor Zac. We are pastors at Westside Reformed Church, a URC congregation in Cincinnati, Ohio. Today we wanted to talk about collection, collecting offerings and these kinds of things within a liturgical worship service. But kind of broadly, before we kind of get into any sort of specifics, why are we talking about collection?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I've had some personal studies on this recently, and it's something that really fascinates me. And there are a couple reasons that I started to undertake this time of study. And one of them was just the kind of practical thing that I think every church across the world recently experienced during the whole COVID thing, where all of a sudden the passing of an offering plate or offering bags was suspended, and that caused a lot of angst for people. On one hand, just a practical one of, how does the church function if they're not having a financial collection? And so those who had been collecting within the worship service proper, they had to make other accommodations. And now that the whole COVID thing has finished, or whatever you want to call it, now the question ends up becoming, well, should we return to doing that? I've even heard some pastors say, actually, we kind of like not having it. And so why don't we just maintain not having one in the worship service? And so there's a broadly cultural reason I wanted to kind of investigate this, but even more specifically, within Westside Reformed Church, we, from the beginning, did not have a collection within the liturgy proper. We actually chose from the beginning to have a collection box immediately outside of our worship space, where you would deposit your offering as you came into the place of worship or as you left the place of worship, and that would be then how it was done. And so I begun to come across some biblical texts that maybe were challenging that the direction that I led our church in, and maybe suggesting to me that maybe it was time to revisit the practice. And so both from that kind of COVID-19 angle, but also from the kind of biblical textual angle, I felt like it's been important to revisit this topic.
Is there anything historical within the kind of the Reformed Church that maybe kind of got you also thinking about this?
Yeah, absolutely. I was originally pushed in the direction of not having a collection within the service proper by maybe my favorite modern theologian and writer, Hughes Oliphant Old. I just love the guy. I love his works. I just read as much of him as I can. But one of the things that he said within within some of his books is he really does not believe that there was an offering, a collection within the liturgy proper among the Reformed churches back in the 16th and early 17th centuries. He's very emphatic upon that, and I, took that and said, okay, well, he knows what he's talking about. The guy is just a great scholar, and so I took that, and I think recently, as I've been reading, I realized that he probably wasn't right. Actually, he wasn't right. I was reading from a scholar named Elsie Ann McKee, who's a scholar not only of liturgy but also of social history, and she actually points out that the liturgies of the 16th and 17th centuries, they didn't include an offering, but that didn't mean that offerings were not collected within the worship service, because you actually have to go to different sources, not just the liturgical forms, to find out this information. You need to go to social history and to records that are being kept within the civil government even, or minutes that were taken by the deacons. And one of the funnier tidbits that I picked up on is that it was actually very common for them to collect the offering in the middle of the sermon. So as the minister is preaching, you would have deacons or maybe one deacon walking around and collecting an offering in the very middle of the sermon as the preacher is preaching. And to me, that's just completely nuts. I've never heard of something like that, never seen something like that. And after those collections would be made, they'd be later deposited in front of the congregation as almost like a way of showing them, hey, this is what you do with your money, bring it to this spot, put it into this box. And so there were collections being taken before and after the service, like our practices at Westside Reformed Church, but also being done during the service, even during the sermon itself, and at other points also. And so, but those were not things you can pick up from the liturgical forms. You have to pick it up elsewhere.
Well, that makes sense. And if you're just looking at like their bulletin, as it were.
That's right, exactly.
And you're saying, well, it just says sermon, but really in the sermon, the deacons are going to walk around and collect. You wouldn't pick it up. Yeah. And so is there a distinction between different types of collection? You know, sometimes when we think of collection in our mind, we're thinking of just like a general collection. But was there maybe differences between maybe a diaconal thing versus other?
Yeah, I think that there has been for certain, and it's hard to kind of to get spliced through some of these things, but I think we probably are wise if we begin by thinking about some of the Old Testament system of offerings, where we have different kinds of offerings that are being offered. You have at sometimes there are food offerings, so animals or grain. You can also have some financial offerings being brought in with the various tithing systems, but they weren't just tithing money. They were also tithing food and produce from their fields. And so some of these things kind of get mixed together. But when you look at the different kinds of tithes that were being taken up, some of them are what we might call a tithe in our day. In other words, like 10% that's being given toward like the liturgical budget of your church. Or another tithe, the 10% was being given toward the king, his palace, and his army that he was raising up. There's another tithe that was an every, I think, 3-year tithe that was then, kind of a 3.3% per year, if you want to call it that then went toward the poor. So different kinds of tithes. I think that probably in the Old Testament, that each year they were actually giving about 33.33% of their earnings toward the different kinds of tithes. But yes, there was a distinction there between the kind of tithe for the Levitical system, a tithe toward your own feasting for the feast days, a tithe toward the king and toward the civil government, and then a distinct tithe that we could call benevolence toward the poor, a sort of diaconal consideration. And I think that those different considerations were important for Israel to be mindful that they were supporting different things through their giving. So similarly, in our day, we give toward the civil government in our taxes, and our government goes well beyond 10%, of course. But there is that aspect within our giving. There's the kind of giving toward the church and our liturgical consideration. I think it's also wise to have to be mindful that we're not just giving toward the bottom line budget of our church, but we're also caring for those within the church who have mercy needs, and toward the benevolence as well. How might that get worked out? It might be worked out in wisdom in different contexts, in different places, but I think it's important for people to be mindful that they're not just giving to the upkeep of a building, to the pastor's salary. I think they also need to be very mindful that we're taking care of our brothers and sisters who are in need as well.
And so thinking like thematically about like what the offering is symbolizing and what the collection is doing, is there like obviously maybe not in the middle of the sermon, but is there maybe an ideal place you can think about? Now obviously this has to be worked out and polished some, but is there maybe like a kind of a better place for it within the liturgical flow of things in your mind?
I do think so, and I think that I could say there are better places where it could be put than others. I think that as we consider our Protestant emphasis on gratitude as a response to God's grace, and that God is the one who saves us, and then we respond by giving ourselves as living sacrifices of thanks and of praise, that helps us to then think about how we might conceive of an offering within a service. So I think it should be therefore in a place where there's a very clear response to God, and that the priority is being given to God and His Word, toward God and His gift toward us. So maybe two places that could be the best would be, for example, after the sermon would be a very, I think, ideal place to place an offering. So you're responding to the word preached, and you're then giving yourself to God through the emblems of money or some other kind of emblem that's being given to God as that to embody your self-giving. So I think that's really what all offerings were. Whether it's on animals or money, it's the offering of yourself to God. And so that could be done after the sermon. I've also been in a URC church that took up that offering immediately after the Lord's Supper. And so that could also be, I think, a very appropriate place to put an offering. And then again, you could still do it if you wanted to outside the service, but maybe more formally as you're leaving the worship service right after the benediction. I think that could be an okay place as well. But I think I'm being pushed more in the direction of being within the liturgy proper. Mm-hmm. And I probably prefer the more historical place of doing it right after the sermon and before moving into the Lord's Supper. Mm-hmm. So that seems to be maybe the tracks that have been laid by the Christian church, east and west, across the generations, and might be a helpful place to do it.
Sure. Yeah. Any closing thoughts that you would want to say about it, or?
I think maybe just to point out a couple difficulties that we're wrestling through as a council, and I'm trying to wrestle through as I'm doing maybe some more in-depth work on it. There's the difficulty of moving toward a cashless society. And this is not the ideal time to be thinking about having an offering, is it? When we are kind of getting away from paper cash and coins, and even getting away from checks, moving more toward like online giving only. That's not very helpful if you're thinking about an offering. And so I think that's important just to raise that. That's a difficulty that churches are going to need to consider. I think it's also important to recognize that when we do have these offerings within a worship service, that I think that we could do a much better job of emphasizing the self-giving nature of an offering. That we're not just giving that thing, that money or whatever it is, but you're really giving yourself. And I think that probably could be highlighted more in order that people understand theologically what's going on. You're not just paying for the sermon, you're not paying for the Lord's Supper or something along those lines, some gross transaction, but really it's that self-offering of a living sacrifice, and that we give by way of those tokens that are placed in a plate or whatever. And I think that also helps people who might not be inclined to give to actually begin to give if they see it in that theological way. That's where your treasure is, there your heart is also. Mm-hmm. And so we really are giving ourselves to the Lord. Mm-hmm. And if we're refusing to give toward an offering, well, then maybe we're refusing to give ourselves as well. I think that's an important question we need to then ask ourselves. Mm-hmm. But I think those are some of the kind of maybe more practical pastoral considerations that each body of elders and deacons needs to consider for themselves. And, last thing I found to be very helpful from Elsie Ann McKee, she was emphasizing that within the Reformed tradition, one of the really helpful things about the offering is that it really gave an important place to the diaconate, and it helped to bring together worship and piety toward God with charity toward our neighbor. It kind of brings those two things together in order that our worship, our liturgy, which is really vertically directed, also has that horizontal component that is part and parcel of the Lord's Supper, where we're really loving each other. And so the offering really helps to bring that to bear, that our worship leads to our love. And so I think that the importance of the ministry of Word and Sacrament with care for the poor and one another is, I think, really brought together, integrated with an offering as well. So some various angles there that could be fleshed out a lot more, but that's just rapid fire for you.
No, that's helpful to think about in terms of the theological reasons and the giving of yourself, not only for the ministry of word and sacrament, but also for the poor in terms of charity, also for mission work and
That's right.
Church planting, developing, all of these things, and wanting to give of yourself. I think it's helpful.
And I think within that, one of the critiques that might be helpful to bring us out a little bit more is that oftentimes the Reformed Church is criticized as being too heady, and you gather and you worship, but it doesn't affect your life. Well, the point of this is saying that the offering is one way of really emphasizing this affects real life, because it brings to bear the fruits of your labors, and it brings to a liturgical expression the importance of our love for one another as being the important outflow of these things. And so I think it really helps to avoid that criticism of being an entirely intellectualized or even a Gnostic kind of religion, is to have those tangible things and that really embody our love that needs to be our proper response to those great and glorious truths.
Yeah, and even as we're drawing attention to it within the liturgy proper, perhaps people will be more aware, and maybe other people have just been not giving. Maybe they don't know where it goes. Maybe they don't know what it is. But when you're thinking like, hey, I'm helping buy groceries for that family. Hey, I'm helping this missionary in the Ukraine. Hey, I'm helping the ministry of word and sacrament continue week after week. When you're seeing kind of here, I'm actually supporting this. I'm giving myself. I'm joining arms with my brothers and sisters in order to propagate, all of these great tasks that Christ has called us to. You become, I think, more excited in doing that. I hope that this has been helpful for you. Again, we are Cincy Reform, sponsored by Westside Reformed Church. You can find our previous podcast at cincyreform.org, and we look forward to seeing you next week.